I have a question. Your YouTube channel is called Diogenes in a Barrel. But who exactly was Diogenes?
Well, we know that he certainly was not timid. He liked to provoke, especially those in power. One famous anecdote is his encounter with Alexander the Great in Thrace. This is a well-known story. It exists in various versions. The most reliable is perhaps that by his namesake, Diogenes Laertius.
As he was sunning himself in the Cranion, Alexander stood over him and said, "Ask whatever you wish of me." And he replied, "Stand out of my light."
In a later tradition by Plutarch, an addition is made to this anecdote.
It is said that Alexander was so impressed by this, and by the arrogance and grandeur of spirit of a man who could treat him with such disdain, that he said to his courtiers, who were laughing and joking about the philosopher as they were walking away, "But I'll tell you this, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes."
I just can't believe it.
But that could well have been the case. After all, Alexander the Great was not just a military man. He also had the philosopher Aristotle as a teacher. Alexander was well educated and certainly had respect for philosophers. The thinking of Alexander and Diogenes has similarities. They both had radical ideas and no respect for tradition. Alexander the Great cut the Gordian knot with the sword. Diogenes took a similar, brutal approach, only with words. Above all, they were both cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitanism was unusual at the time. Its roots can be traced back to Socrates. With Alexander the Great, however, it had very real consequences. In the vast empire he conquered, all cultures were tolerated, and one of the best-known philosophers of cosmopolitanism at the time was Diogenes of Sinope. Another anecdote illustrates that two respected each other.
Alexander came up to him and said, "Aren't you afraid of me?" "Well, tell me this," asked Diogenes. "Are you a good thing or a bad one?" And when Alexander replied, "A good one," he said, "Then who's afraid of what is good?"
Of course, there are major differences between Diogenes and Alexander. Diogenes was a pacifist. He did not hide this conviction. There's also an anecdote about Alexander the Great's father, Philip of Macedon.
Dionysius the Stoic recounts that after the Battle of Chaeronea, Diogenes was arrested and brought in front of Philip. And when he was asked who he was, he replied, "A spy who has come to observe your insatiable greed." A response which so impressed the king that he set him free.
Did Philip of Macedon not punish him?
The fact that Diogenes was not punished is certainly due to Philip's understanding of Diogenes' sense of humor. Diogenes was a funny guy.
Seeing an incompetent archer, he sat down beside the target, saying, "Just to make sure I don't get shot."
The more incompetent the shooter, the closer they should be to the target.
Diogenes was what we would call a free thinker today.
When asked what is the finest thing of all in life, he said, "Plain speaking."
But that certainly didn't please everyone.
You're absolutely right. There are many anecdotes about him outraging others with his behavior or hurting their feelings with his statements. These stories are not as clear to us today because they refer to customs and traditions that are no longer familiar to us.
Can you give an example of this?
Yes. In ancient Greece, it was customary to spit on the floor. Of course, they always choose a dirty corner. Keep this in mind when you hear the following anecdote.
When someone conducted him into a magnificent house and warned him not to spit, and he then wanted to clear his throat, he spat into the man's face, saying that he could not find any worse place.
Okay, I understand the moral of the story. Diogenes is criticizing the vanity of the man who places too much value on material possessions. But did he only make jokes? Or did he practice philosophy too?
Unfortunately, none of his books have survived. We only know about him through other authors, especially his namesake, Diogenes Laertius, who wrote biographies of famous philosophers centuries later. The problem with many ancient philosophers is that their texts have not survived. This makes it impossible to gain an accurate understanding of their philosophy. Consequently, everything we can say about Diogenes is open to interpretation. Diogenes, of course, grappled with fundamental questions and criticized the philosophers of his time. The most famous of these was Plato. Plato developed the theories of ideas, assigning general concepts to phenomena in the world. He also attempted to define these concepts.
Give me an example.
Plato gave a definition of a human being. Many of Plato's contemporaries found it satisfactory. However, Diogenes showed it was incomplete.
Plato defined man as a two-footed animal without wings, and was applauded for it. So Diogenes plucked a cock and brought it into the lecture hall, saying, "Here's Plato's man." As a result, the definition was supplemented with the phrase, "having broad nails."
Diogenes' teacher, Antisthenes, mocked Plato and said that he could see horses but not horseness. Plato argued that most people cannot recognize ideas. They live in a cave and can only see the shadows of things as they appear in the cave. However, if you leave the cave and go out into the light, you can see the general concepts and understand the essence of things. Diogenes mocked this allegory of the cave.
He lit a lamp in full daylight and walked around with it, saying, "I'm searching for a man."
Diogenes took all his provocations very seriously. For him, philosophy was not just a way of thinking, but a way of life. He lived according to his convictions. While he mocked wealth and vanity, he himself lived modestly. His home was a barrel. Technically, it was a paitos, a large jug that could be so big that you could climb into it. Later artists depicted him in a barrel. There are many portrayals like this one by Puget. He lived for his philosophy and had no income. He only begged for the bare necessities and had no aspirations. In fact, he even begged in front of a statue to train himself not to have his wishes fulfilled. He was content with the simplest of things.
On seeing a youth using his hollowed hand to scoop up a drink from some water that was flowing by, Diogenes immediately threw away the cup that he had used for drinking, saying that nature had provided him with hands that were better and more useful for that purpose.
Perhaps you can also exaggerate it.
Diogenes lived an ascetic life to free himself from his prejudices. For him, true wealth lay elsewhere.
When asked by Aristippus what he had gained from philosophy, he replied, "To be rich without having an obol." When asked who is rich among men, he replied, "He who is self-sufficient."
In any case, he was consistent.
He was also resilient. Of course, he was harshly criticized. Many viewed his radicalism with amusement.
When someone said to him, "Most people laugh at you," he replied, "And doubtless donkeys laugh at them. But just as they pay no heed to the donkeys, I pay none to them."
Others didn't find him funny. They thought he was crazy. He responded by saying the following:
"It's not that I'm out of my mind. It's that I don't have the same mind as you."
The basis of his thinking are criticism and self-criticism.
Diogenes said that to come off well in life, one needs either good friends or ardent enemies. For friends instruct you, and enemies expose your faults.
That is practical wisdom.
However, Diogenes was not a provocateur in a barrel his whole life. He took a voyage to Aegina, where he was captured by pirates. They then took him to a slave market in Crete. They tried to sell him, but it wasn't easy at first.
When the auctioneer asked him what he was skilled at, he replied, "Governing men."
There probably weren't many buyers.
According to the story, Diogenes chose his buyer.
He then pointed to a Corinthian who was wearing a fine purple-bordered robe, a man called Xeniades, and said, "Sell me to that man. He could do with a master."
Was Xeniades okay with that?
Well, back then, slaves weren't just used for hard labor. They worked in almost every profession. Tutors could be slaves too. Xeniades would certainly have noticed that Diogenes was an educated man. In any case, Xeniades bought him. The story goes that he made the right choice.
So, Xeniades bought him, took him to Corinth, and put him in charge of his children, and entrusted his entire household to him. And he administered it so well in every regard that Xeniades used to go around saying, "A good guardian spirit has entered my house."
Of course, Diogenes would not be Diogenes if he could not justify this position. He told his master that a slave is not obliged to obey orders from his master, if he acts in his master's best interests.
He used to say to his master Xenidas that he should obey him even though he was a slave, for if a doctor or a steersman were a slave, one would still need to obey him.
That makes sense to me. Xeniades wasn't stupid, but I wonder if a rebel can be a good educator.
There are two Diogenes. One is the young Diogenes who went to Athens and became a pupil of Antisthenes. He lived in a barrel and challenged the citizens of Athens with his skepticism. After being captured by pirates, sold as a slave and working as an educator, Diogenes dedicated himself to the education of Xeniades' children. He took responsibility for his actions.
On seeing a child behaving in a disorderly manner, Diogenes struck his pedagogue, saying, "Why did you teach him to behave like that?"
He must have been a good teacher.
In any case, his students appreciated him later on.
He said that education is a source of self-control for the young, a consolation for the old, a treasure for the poor, and an adornment for the rich.
There are many legends surrounding his death.
Diogenes had quite the adventurous life.
He started a movement. His followers are known as the Cynics. The name is derived from Diogenes' surname, the dog, in Greek, Koan. We are not sure how he got his surname. In any case, the Cynics were an important philosophical school before the Stoics. For them, philosophy was not a theory, but an activity. Diogenes' philosophy greatly influenced the Stoicism, especially Epictetus. For Diogenes, life was never stagnant. It was not a status that could be achieved. Life is a journey that always leads to tomorrow.
When asked what is most precious in life, he said, "Hope."
I hope you liked this video. Click the subscribe button and see you next time.